Hey guys, tonight we are going to peel back the layers of chivalry and romance to look at the cold, hard reality of finding a partner in the Middle Ages. Picture it, not the fairy tale castle with fluttering banners, but a drafty stone hall that smells faintly of wet dog and wood smoke. You're shivering, not from the cold, but because your future is being decided in the corner by two men who are more interested in the quality of your father's pasture land than the quality of your character. Let's be honest, if you were actually dropped into this world, you probably wouldn't survive the wedding night, let alone the marriage, what with the questionable hygiene and the very real chance your new spouse has a vested interest in you not living long enough to inherit their dower. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. As always, I love to see where you're all listening from, so drop your city and the time in the comments below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Close your eyes for a moment and just listen. Hear the crackle of the fire in the great hearth. It's the only real source of warmth in this vast, stone room. The tapestries on the wall, depicting a grim-looking hunt, do little to stop the damp chill that seeps into your bones. You are standing near the edge of the room, trying to be as small and unnoticeable as possible, but you can feel the weight of the moment pressing down on you. Over by a heavy oak table, your father is in quiet, serious conversation with another man, a neighboring lord, perhaps, or a wealthy merchant from the town, his velvet robes a stark contrast to your family's worn but serviceable wool. They aren't laughing. There are no warm smiles or friendly gestures. Instead, there are maps spread out on the table, a deed with a heavy wax seal, and the occasional low murmur about acreage, river access, and timber rights. This is the medieval marriage marketplace, and you, whether you are a young man or a young woman, are the primary commodity. This isn't about love. It's not even really about you. It's about the consolidation of power, the merging of lands, the ending of a feud, or the beginning of a powerful new alliance. For the nobility and the landed gentry, a marriage is a business transaction, plain and simple. It's a tool of statecraft and economics. Your personal feelings on the matter are, at best, a secondary concern. At worst, they are an irrelevant and inconvenient complication. You are a bridge between two families, a living, breathing contract designed to secure a future for everyone, except, perhaps, your own heart. Your father isn't trying to find you a soulmate. He's trying to secure a politically advantageous son-in-law or a daughter-in-law with a dowry that can restock the family coffers. It's the ultimate form of networking, and the stakes are impossibly high. And this process often starts uncomfortably early. Forget dating apps. Your future could be sealed before you can even properly walk or talk. The practice of child betrothal was common, especially among the upper classes. Imagine a formal ceremony, not in a grand church, but in a room much like this one. You are perhaps 4 years old, and you are being held by your mother. Opposite you is another child, your intended, maybe 5 or 6, looking equally bewildered and probably more interested in a wooden toy soldier clutched in his fist. The two fathers clasp hands. Words are spoken over your heads, Latin phrases mumbled by a priest that mean nothing to you. This is a promise, a sponsalia de futuro, a betrothal for the future. You might exchange a ring or a kiss on the cheek, a strange and formal gesture between two small children who would rather be chasing chickens in the bailey. Then you are sent back to your respective homes, sometimes for years, to be raised apart until you come of age. You are legally bound to a person you don't know, a name and a face you might only vaguely recall from a handful of formal, awkward visits. It sounds terribly final, a life sentence passed down in your infancy. But here is where the medieval world surprises you with a small, yet significant, glimmer of personal agency. The church, for all its rules, drew a firm line between a betrothal, a promise to marry, and a marriage itself. A true marriage required consent, and consent could only be given by individuals who had reached the legal age. For a girl, that age was 12. For a boy, it was 14. So picture it now. Years have passed. The memory of that small, formal ceremony is a faint and distant thing. You are now a young woman of 12. You are brought before a bishop or a church official. Your family is there. Your betrothed's family is there. The pressure in the room is immense. The future of two houses, the carefully negotiated contracts, all of it rests on what you say next. And you are asked a simple question. Do you consent to this union? You can look at this stranger, this person you've been promised to your entire life, and you can say, I do. Or you can say, I do not. And if you say no, the betrothal is dissolved. Legally, it is null and void. The same right is afforded to your betrothed when he turns 14. It is a shocking and unexpected get-out clause in an otherwise rigid system. This is a mainstream historical fact, recorded in canon law. However, historians still argue about how often this right was actually exercised. The social and familial pressure to consent would have been enormous. To refuse would be to undo years of planning, to potentially insult a powerful family, and to bring a certain amount of shame upon your own. It was a choice, yes, but perhaps for many, it wasn't a real choice at all. Still, the fact that it existed at all is a fascinating crack in the cold facade of the arranged marriage. But let's assume you consent. Or, let's assume your marriage is being arranged now that you are of age. The negotiations begin in earnest, and they revolve around one key thing, your price tag. This comes in two parts, the dowry and the dower. The dowry is what your family gives to the groom's family upon your marriage. It is, essentially, payment for taking you off their hands and for the burden of supporting you. This isn't a token gift. It's a substantial transfer of wealth. Forget a nice set of dinner plates or a contribution to the honeymoon fund. We're talking serious assets. Depending on your station, your dowry might be a chest of silver coins, vast tracts of fertile land, a herd of 50 cattle, a flock of 100 sheep, a ship, or the rights to collect tolls on a particular road. It is your entire inheritance, paid up front. A poor dowry could make you an undesirable match, no matter how beautiful or accomplished you were. A great dowry could make an otherwise plain or difficult woman the catch of the season. It's all terribly practical. Then there is the dower. This is your safety net, your medieval life insurance policy. The dower is the portion of your husband's property that is promised to you for your use should he die before you do. This was often negotiated just as fiercely as the dowry. Typically, it was about a third of the husband's lands and assets at the time of the marriage. This wasn't just a romantic gesture. It was a legally binding promise to ensure a widow wouldn't be left destitute. A wise woman, or at least a woman with a wise father, paid very close attention to the dower lands. Were they profitable? Were they secure? It was her guarantee of survival. And on the morning after the wedding, the groom would bestow the morning gift, or morgengabe. This was a personal gift from him to you, a recognition of the consummation of the marriage and your transition into a wife. It was yours to keep, separate from the dower. It could be a piece of jewelry, a purse of coins, or sometimes even a small estate. It was a final, intimate layer to the complex financial onion of getting married. You might not have love, but if you were lucky and well negotiated, you had security. Your value wasn't measured in sonnets or stolen glances, but in livestock, land, and legally binding documents. It's a bit like checking the prenup, except the prenup also includes a specified number of pigs. So you stand there in the cold hall as the men finalize the terms. Your future isn't a romantic adventure waiting to unfold. It's a contract, a merger. The best you can hope for is a partner who is not unkind, lands that are fertile, and a life of quiet, predictable stability. Love, if it comes at all, will have to find a way to grow in the cracks, a resilient wildflower pushing its way through the cold, hard stones of duty and economics. You've survived the negotiations. The contracts are signed, the dowry has been inspected, and the dower lands have been formally promised. Now comes the awkward part, getting to know the person you are legally bound to spend the rest of your life with. There is no concept of dating as you might understand it. No quiet dinners, no long walks in the park, no endlessly texting to dissect every nuance of your last conversation. The period between the betrothal and the wedding, or even the time leading up to an arranged marriage, is a strange and stilted dance of heavily chaperoned encounters. Imagine yourself in a castle garden. It's not the wild, romantic tangle of roses you might picture. It's a practical space, a herber, with raised beds for medicinal herbs, vegetables, and a few symbolic flowers. You are allowed to walk here with your intended, but you are not alone. Not even close. Your mother, his mother, a priest, and probably a few of your ladies-in-waiting are all hovering just a few feet away, their conversation a low hum, their eyes missing nothing. Privacy is a luxury you do not have. So, how do you flirt? How do you signal interest or affection in this high-surveillance environment? It's a language of subtle gestures. You might accidentally drop your handkerchief, a classic move, allowing him to stoop and retrieve it, your fingers brushing for a fleeting, electric moment. He might offer you a piece of fruit from a tree, a simple, wholesome gesture that feels loaded with unspoken meaning. You could compliment the quality of his hawk's training, or he might praise your skill at embroidery. These are the medieval equivalents of swiping right. It's all incredibly awkward, a bit like a middle school dance where everyone is watching and the chaperones are armed. You might exchange small gifts. A ribbon from your sleeve, given to him to tie onto his lance for a tournament. A poem he has written, or more likely, paid a more literate clerk to write for him, full of stilted praise for your eyes or your virtuous nature. These tokens are everything. They are the currency of this premarital dance, tangible proof of a connection, however fragile. Historians still argue whether these highly formalized rituals allowed for any genuine emotional connection to form, or if they were simply part of the performance of aristocratic life. Was it possible to fall in love during these stiff, chaperoned walks, or were you just learning the steps to a dance you were both obligated to perform? And what does it take to be considered attractive in this world? Forget your modern ideals. The things you might value, a tan, toned muscles, a full set of gleaming white teeth, are not the marks of beauty here. In fact, a tan would suggest you labor in the fields, a sign of low birth. True aristocratic beauty is pale, almost luminous, a sign that you have spent your life indoors, away from the sun. Women use powders made from wheat flour or, more dangerously, lead, to achieve this ghostly complexion. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from ancient Egypt? Medieval cosmetics weren't always a massive improvement, but the most striking and, to our eyes, unusual beauty standard is the high forehead. A wide, smooth, elegantly domed forehead is the height of fashion. To achieve this look, women would pluck their hairlines, sometimes by several inches, to create a vast, uninterrupted expanse of pale skin. Eyebrows were plucked into near non-existence, creating thin, barely there arches. The ideal face is oval, egg-like, and serene. It's a look that feels more alien than alluring to the modern eye, but to the medieval courtier, it was the epitome of feminine grace. Your goal is to look less like a human and more like a serene, otherworldly creature. A bit of light humor here, but can you imagine the sheer effort of maintaining that plucked hairline? It's a level of commitment that makes modern brow shaping look like child's play. For men, the ideals are less about facial modification and more about physique and bearing. A strong, broad-shouldered build is desirable, but not in the way of a bodybuilder. It's the strength of a warrior, the physique needed to wear 50 pounds of mail and swing a heavy sword. Long legs are also prized, often accentuated by colorful hose. A well-turned calf was apparently something to be admired. It's a beauty born of function. The ideal man looks like he can protect his lands and lead his men into battle. And a well-groomed beard, for those who could grow one, was a sign of virility and maturity. Amidst all this talk of contracts and physical appearances, a strange new idea is beginning to take hold in the courts of southern France, spreading north like a slow, sweet perfume. It's called amour courtois, or courtly love, and it is, essentially, a beautifully packaged human resources nightmare. This is a mainstream historical fact, a literary and social phenomenon that profoundly shaped medieval ideals of romance. But it's not about marriage. In fact, it's almost entirely separate from it. Courtly love is the art of adoring a woman you cannot, and should not, have. Typically, she is a noble lady of high standing, and more often than not, she is married to someone else, often your own lord. The courtly lover, usually a young knight or squire, pledges himself to the service of his chosen lady. He performs great deeds in her name, wears her colors in tournaments, and writes her passionate poetry filled with sighs and longing. He suffers beautifully, his love a pure, ennobling force that makes him a better knight and a more virtuous man. The lady, for her part, remains distant, chaste, and in control. She might offer him small favors, a scarf, a smile, a kind word, to encourage his devotion, but the love is meant to be unconsummated. It is a game of exquisite tension and deferred gratification. Think of it as the ultimate long-distance relationship, except the distance is social and moral, not geographical. It's all about the yearning, not the having. The famous stories of courtly love, like that of Lancelot and Queen Guinevere, are popular precisely because they break the rules. Their tragedy is that they gave in to a physical love that was supposed to remain a pure spiritual adoration. This whole concept is born from literature, from the songs of the troubadours, and it bleeds into real court life. Young men and women learned the rules of this elaborate game. It provided an outlet for the romantic and emotional feelings that the pragmatic institution of marriage simply couldn't accommodate. It allowed you to experience the soaring highs and devastating lows of love without actually threatening the all-important social order. Mostly. Of course, it was a delicate balance. A lord had to tolerate his knights mooning over his wife, seeing it as a testament to her beauty and his own high status. But if the adoration crossed the line from poetic suffering to actual intimacy, the consequences could be severe for both the knight and the lady. It's a system that seems designed to create drama. It's a bit like setting up an elaborate display of fine china and then encouraging everyone to practice juggling next to it. Something is bound to get broken. One of the more quirky tidbits from this era is the idea of courts of love. These were supposedly real gatherings, presided over by noble women like Eleanor of Aquitaine, where lovers would bring their romantic disputes to be judged. Cases might include questions like, can true love exist between married people? The supposed answer was often no. Or, if a knight's lady commands him to do something dishonorable, must he obey? Historians today largely believe these courts were more of a literary fantasy, a parlor game for bored aristocrats, rather than actual judicial bodies. But the fact that people wrote about them shows how deeply this idea of love as a complex, rule-based art form had penetrated the noble imagination. So you exist in this strange dual world. On one hand, your marriage is a business deal, your spouse a strategic partner. Your daily life is governed by pragmatism. On the other hand, you are surrounded by a culture that celebrates an idealized, impossible love, a love that is passionate, all-consuming, and almost always directed at someone you're not married to. You are expected to be a dutiful spouse in reality and a pining, lovesick poet in fantasy. It's a complicated and perhaps deeply unsatisfying way to live and to love, navigating the chasm between duty and desire. The awkward, chaperoned walks are over. The fine details of the dowry have been settled. The day of your wedding has finally arrived. But if you are picturing a quiet, intimate ceremony with a few close family and friends, you need to adjust your expectations. A medieval wedding, especially for the nobility or landed classes, is a public spectacle. It is a legal and social event for the entire community, and it doesn't even start inside the church. You find yourself standing on the porch, at the very entrance to the church, in facie ecclesi, before the face of the church. The heavy oak doors are behind you. Before you is a crowd. It's not just your family and your new in-laws. It's a gathering of tenants, villagers, local merchants, and assorted hangers-on. They are all here to bear witness. This is not for romance. It is for legal transparency. The priest stands with you, his vestments bright against the weathered gray stone of the church. He will guide you through the vows. First, he addresses the crowd, announcing the union and asking if anyone knows of any impediment, a prior contract, a secret marriage, or a forbidden degree of blood relation that would prevent it from taking place. You hold your breath. This is the medieval version of speak now or forever hold your peace, and it is taken very seriously. An objection here could halt everything. Assuming no one shouts out a dramatic, last-minute revelation, the ceremony proceeds. The vows are exchanged. You might not speak them in Latin, but in your own vernacular tongue, so that everyone present can understand the promises you are making. This is a binding verbal contract. Then comes a crucial part of the public ceremony, the formal endowment of the dower. Your new husband will state, for all to hear, exactly what lands and properties will be yours for your lifetime if you are widowed. This public declaration makes it a legally enforceable promise. The crowd of tenants now knows who their potential future mistress might be. It's all about making the transfer of property and status clear, unambiguous, and witnessed by many. The ring is given, a simple gold or silver band, placed by the groom first on your thumb, then your index finger, then your middle finger, saying in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, before finally settling it on your fourth finger. This is a mainstream historical fact, the origin of the ring finger tradition, stemming from the belief that a special vein, the vena amoris, ran directly from that finger to the heart. It's a rare moment of sweet symbolism in an otherwise starkly practical event. Only after these legalities are concluded at the door does the wedding party move inside the church for the nuptial Massachusetts. The public, legal part is over. The private, religious part begins. After the Mass, the celebration starts. A feast is held, its lavishness dependent on your social standing. For a great lord, it's an epic affair with multiple courses of roasted meats, intricate sugar sculptures called subtleties, and entertainment from musicians and acrobats. For a simple farmer, it might be a more humble gathering with ale, bread, and a roasted pig, but the spirit is the same, a communal celebration. You sit at the high table, a guest of honor at your own life-changing event, making polite conversation while probably feeling a growing sense of nervous anticipation about the evening to come. Because the public nature of your wedding day is far from over. As the feast winds down and evening falls, the most uncomfortable part of the entire process begins, the bedding ceremony. There is no quiet, romantic retreat to the bridal chamber for the two of you. Instead, your wedding guests, often fueled by a great deal of wine, will escort you there in a noisy, boisterous procession. Imagine a crowd of people, carrying candles and torches, laughing and singing, leading you and your spouse up the winding stone staircase to your bedchamber. The room is filled with your family and closest friends. They are here to help you prepare for bed. This is not a task you perform in private. Your ladies-in-waiting will help you out of your heavy wedding gown, while the groom's attendants do the same for him in another corner of the room. There's a lot of joking and ribald commentary. It's meant to be celebratory and to ease the tension, but it's hard to imagine it feeling anything other than deeply, profoundly awkward. A bit like having your entire office follow you home to watch you get into your pajamas. Once you are both in your nightclothes, the priest returns. He blesses the bed, sprinkling it with holy water to ward off any demons or evil spirits that might try to interfere with the marriage's purpose, namely, the creation of heirs. He might say a prayer for fertility and a peaceful night. Then, with everyone still watching, you and your new husband get into bed. You are propped up against the pillows as guests come forward to offer you a final drink, typically a caudle, a warm, spiced wine or ale thickened with eggs and bread, thought to be an aphrodisiac and to give you strength for the night ahead. Finally, the bed curtains are drawn. The guests may not stay in the room, but they might linger right outside the door for a time, their voices a low murmur. Privacy is an illusion. The entire community has participated in your journey to the marriage bed. This peculiar and invasive ritual served a very important purpose. It provided witnesses to the fact that the bride and groom had been put to bed together, bringing them to the very brink of the final legal step of the marriage, consummation. Because in the eyes of medieval canon law, a marriage was not fully and irrevocably binding until it had been physically consummated. This is the crucial legal distinction between a ratified marriage and an unratified one. All the vows, contracts, and ceremonies meant nothing if this final act did not take place. The lack of consummation was the single most common reason for an annulment, the medieval equivalent of divorce. A marriage could be dissolved if one party could prove that the other was unable or unwilling to perform their marital duties. This turned the marriage bed from a private space of intimacy into a stage for a legal requirement. If, after a time, the marriage remained unconsummated, one could petition the church courts. A woman could claim her husband was impotent. A man could claim his wife was physically incapable or that she refused him. Proving these claims, as you can imagine, was a difficult and often humiliating ordeal. Historians still argue about the reliability and nature of the evidence presented in these cases. The court might hear testimony from the individuals themselves. Sometimes, in cases of alleged impotence, a man might be required to prove his virility with another woman. More often, a panel of discreet matrons or physicians might be ordered to physically examine the wife or husband to look for signs of virginity or physical impediments. The details recorded in these surviving court cases are often invasive and deeply personal, a stark reminder that what happened, or didn't happen, in the bedroom was a matter of public and legal concern. So as you lie there in the dark, with the scent of spiced wine and blessed water in the air, you are acutely aware of the weight of expectation. The future of your family alliance, your personal security, and your legal standing all hinge on this one moment. It's the final seal on the contract you've been living out all day. Love may or may not be present in this bed, but law and duty most certainly are. The wedding is over. The bedding ceremony is a mercifully fading memory, and you have settled into the rhythms of married life. You might assume that now, behind the closed doors of your own chamber, you are free to explore your relationship with your spouse. But you would be wrong. The church, which played such a public role in your wedding, does not simply retreat and leave you to your own devices. It follows you right into the bedroom. The medieval church had a vested interest in the sexual lives of its flock, and it developed an astonishingly detailed set of rules and regulations governing when, how, and why a married couple could be intimate. The primary, and many theologians argued, the only legitimate reason for sexual relations within a marriage was for procreation. The creation of heirs was your sacred duty. To engage in the act for pleasure alone was seen as a sin, a venial one, perhaps, but a sin nonetheless. It was a necessary act, but one to be approached with a certain pious reluctance rather than enthusiastic enjoyment. This philosophy led to the creation of a kind of liturgical calendar for your love life. There were vast stretches of the year when intimacy was strictly forbidden. You were expected to abstain during the entire 40 days of Lent, and the 40 days of Advent, and on Sundays, in honor of the resurrection, and on Wednesdays and Fridays, in memory of Christ's betrayal and crucifixion. You were also forbidden from being together on major feast days and saints' days. When you add it all up, it's estimated that for a devout couple following the strictest rules, marital relations were prohibited for close to half the year. It's a bit like having your intimacy schedule dictated by a particularly demanding and spiritually focused project manager. And the rules didn't stop with timing. The church also had opinions on technique. Penitentials, which were handbooks for priests to help them assign penance during confession, contained detailed lists of forbidden acts and positions. The only universally accepted position was the one most straightforwardly oriented towards conception, often referred to as the missionary position. Anything else was suspect. Any act that was seen as prioritizing pleasure over procreation, or any position that made conception less likely, was deemed unnatural and sinful. The penalties for these transgressions ranged from a few extra prayers to days, or even weeks of fasting on bread and water. Your private life was subject to a surprising amount of clerical oversight. Beyond the bedroom, the church's influence extended to who you could marry in the first place. The rules on consanguinity, the prohibition of marrying a blood relative, were incredibly complex and far-reaching. This is a mainstream historical fact that had enormous social and political consequences. In the early Middle Ages, the church forbade marriage within 7 degrees of kinship. This didn't just mean you couldn't marry your first cousin. You couldn't marry your second, third, fourth, fifth, or sixth cousin. To understand how vast this network was, think of it this way. Your first cousin is 2 degrees away from you. You share a grandparent. Your second cousin is 4 degrees away. You share a great-grandparent. 7 degrees meant you had to trace your family tree all the way back to a shared great-great-great-great-great-grandparent. For the aristocracy, who tended to intermarry within a small, exclusive pool of families, finding a suitable spouse who wasn't your 7th cousin or closer could be a genuine challenge. Historians still argue whether these rules were primarily about preventing genetic issues, or if they were a powerful tool for the church to exert control over noble families, forcing them to seek dispensations, for a fee of course, or allowing the church to annul inconvenient political marriages on these grounds. Later, in 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council relaxed the rule from 7 degrees to a more manageable 4, but it remained a significant factor in medieval matchmaking. And the concept of kinship wasn't limited to blood. There was also spiritual kinship. This meant you were forbidden from marrying your godparents or your godchildren. You couldn't even marry the child of your godparent. This spiritual family was considered just as real as your biological one, and the incest taboo applied to it just as strongly. The rules even extended to affinity, meaning you couldn't marry the blood relatives of your deceased spouse. If your wife died, you couldn't then marry her sister or her cousin. All of these overlapping restrictions created a complex web that could ensnare even the most careful families. Faced with all these rules about when to be intimate, how to be intimate, and who you could marry, what did people do? Especially if they wanted to experience affection without necessarily wanting another child. This leads us to the murky and often magical world of medieval contraception. The church condemned contraception outright as a frustration of God's will. But people, as they always have, found ways. The methods they used were a strange and hopeful mix of folklore, herbalism, and pure superstition. They were, for the most part, completely ineffective. Women might drink infusions of herbs believed to have contraceptive properties, like pennyroyal or silphium, a plant that was literally harvested to extinction in antiquity for this very purpose. They might create pessaries from wool soaked in honey, acacia gum, or even, as mentioned in some texts, the old standby of crocodile dung. A practice that dates back to ancient Egypt and apparently had some staying power. The acidic nature of the dung might have had a minor spermicidal effect, but it's hard to imagine it was a popular or pleasant method. Then there was the realm of pure magic. A truly quirky and fringe tidbit from this era is the belief in contraceptive amulets. A woman might be advised to wear a specific charm to prevent pregnancy. The most bizarre of these involved animal parts. For instance, the influential physician Trotula of Salerno, a rare female medical voice from the 11th or 12th century, recorded a folk belief that if a woman wore the testicles of a weasel in a pouch around her neck, she would not conceive. It's a strange image, a noble lady, in her fine gown, with a small, secret pouch containing weasel parts, hoping it will grant her some control over her own body. Other amulets might involve specific stones, written charms, or even the bone of a black cat. For men, the methods were equally dubious. Coitus interruptus was known and practiced, though condemned by the church as a form of spilling the seed. Some texts suggest rudimentary condoms made from animal intestines or bladders, but these were likely rare, expensive, and not widely available. Most people relied on a combination of the rhythm method, which was difficult to track accurately, folk remedies, and a great deal of prayer. They lived in a world where intimacy was fraught with rules, and the consequence of a child was an almost constant possibility. The desire for connection was filtered through a thick screen of religious doctrine and ineffective folk science, a testament to the enduring human impulse to seek both pleasure and control, even against overwhelming odds. You've navigated the transactional marriage proposal, the stilted courtship, the public wedding, and the church's intricate rulebook for your private life. It would be easy to conclude that the medieval world was a loveless place, a cold landscape of duty, property, and procreation. But that isn't the whole story. To assume that genuine love couldn't exist in this environment is to underestimate the resilience of the human heart. Love, it seems, found a way to bloom in the most unlikely of places. We can find the evidence of this unexpected tenderness not in the grand chronicles of kings and battles, but in the small, personal documents that have survived the centuries. Look at the letters exchanged between spouses. While many are formal and deal with household management or estate business, some contain flashes of real affection and concern. A husband away at war or on a pilgrimage might write to his wife, calling her his dearest heart or his sweetest friend, expressing his longing to be home and his prayers for her safety. A wife might write back with news of the children, her words carrying a quiet warmth that transcends the formal language of the time. One famous example is the correspondence between John and Margaret Potton, a gentry couple in 15th century England. Their surviving letters are a remarkable window into their lives. They discuss legal disputes and rent collection, yes, but they also express deep personal affection. Margaret often signs her letters, "By your own MP," and John writes of his desire to be with her. In one letter, after a period of illness and separation, John writes to Margaret, "I pray you that you will not be strange of writing of letters to me betwixt this and that time, for I think it a long season since I lay by you." It's a simple, human sentiment. He misses sleeping next to his wife. It's a powerful reminder that these were real people with real feelings, not just characters in a historical drama about land acquisition. We also see love in their last wills and testaments. A man might leave his wife not just her legally mandated dower, but also specific personal items he knew she cherished. My best silver cup, the red bed with all its hangings, or my book of hours for her soul's comfort. These bequests go beyond legal obligation. They are gestures of personal intimacy and remembrance. They suggest a life shared, full of private jokes and shared possessions. And then there are the tombs. Walk through an old English or French church and look at the effigies of married couples. Sometimes they are depicted lying side by side, their hands clasped together for eternity. The epitaphs carved into the stone can be surprisingly moving. One 15th century epitaph for a knight and his lady reads, "They were lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided." While some of this was convention, the choice to be buried together, to have their images intertwined in stone, often speaks to a bond that they and their families wished to commemorate as one of love and partnership. But what happened when a marriage, for all its legal and social binding, simply failed? What if there was no affection, only misery? As we've touched on, divorce as we know it, a legal dissolution of a valid marriage, did not exist. The church taught that a marriage, once validly contracted and consummated, was a sacrament, a bond made by God that no man could put asunder. But there was a loophole, the annulment. An annulment wasn't a divorce. It was a declaration that a true marriage had never existed in the first place due to some pre-existing impediment. And this is where things could get creative. We already know the most common grounds: a prior contract, a lack of consummation, or forbidden degrees of consanguinity. This last one, as we discussed, was a particularly useful tool for the powerful. If a king or a great lord decided his political alliance with his wife's family was no longer advantageous, he could suddenly discover that they were, in fact, fourth cousins once removed. He would petition the Pope, present his carefully researched genealogical evidence, and if his political clout was strong enough, an annulment might be granted. Eleanor of Aquitaine's first marriage to King Louis VII of France was annulled on the grounds of consanguinity, freeing her to marry the future King Henry II of England. Historians still argue whether these annulments were legitimate applications of canon law or simply a form of religiously sanctioned, politically motivated divorce. For ordinary people, annulment was much harder to obtain, but not impossible. Besides impotence or non-consummation, one could also claim that the marriage was entered into under duress, that one party had not given free consent. Or you could prove the existence of a prior, secret marriage vowed to someone else. It was a complex and expensive legal process, but it offered a slim ray of hope for those in truly untenable situations. For most people, though, if the marriage was unhappy but legally sound, the only option was a form of legal separation, a divorcium immensa et thura, a divorce from bed and board. This allowed a couple to live apart, but they were not free to remarry. It was an admission of failure, a solution that offered peace but not freedom. Given the rigid structures of marriage and the difficulty of escape, it's no wonder that people turned to a more personal, and perhaps more hopeful, solution: magic. If society wouldn't give you the love you craved, maybe you could conjure it yourself. This brings us to the quirky and deeply human world of medieval love magic. People from all walks of life, from servant girls to noble ladies, used love charms and spells. These weren't the dramatic incantations you see in movies. They were small, secret rituals, often blending folk traditions with a veneer of Christian prayer. You might try to win someone's affection by getting them to unknowingly eat a piece of food you had prepared in a special way. A popular method involved baking a cake or a loaf of bread, using flour mixed with your own sweat or other bodily fluids, believing this would physically bind the object of your affection to you. It's a rather unappetizing form of enchantment, but it reveals a desperate desire for a physical, almost biological, connection. Other charms were verbal. You might be told to recite a specific prayer or a rhyming couplet while looking at the person you desired, or while holding an object that belonged to them. You might craft a small doll or image of your beloved and sleep with it, hoping to influence their dreams. You could also use herbs and plants associated with love, like verbena or periwinkle, carrying them on your person, or trying to slip them into the other person's food or drink. Of course, the church condemned all of this as sinful superstition, but the practice was widespread. These folk remedies and charms tell a powerful story. They show that beneath the layers of contracts, dowries, and legal obligations, there was a deep and persistent yearning for romantic love, for personal choice, and for emotional connection. When the official systems of society failed to provide a path to love, people tried to cut their own, using whatever tools they could find, be they a lawyer, a prayer, or a carefully prepared apple. So as we leave this medieval world, we see that the truth about love is, as always, complicated. It was a world where marriage was a business, but where husbands and wives could still miss each other deeply. It was a world where the church laid down a labyrinth of rules, but where people still sought intimacy on their own terms. And it was a world that celebrated a distant, courtly ideal of love, while ordinary people secretly baked their hopes and dreams into a loaf of bread, wishing for nothing more than to be loved in return. The desire to love and be loved is not a modern invention. It is a fundamental part of who we are, a stubborn wildflower pushing its way through the cracks in the stone, then as now. The most perverted queens in medieval history. Settle in. Let the weight of the day drift away, like dust motes dancing in a sliver of moonlight. We are going on a journey, not to a place, but to a time when history was not yet set in stone, but was being written, often with a very biased quill. Imagine, if you will, a small, cold room. The air is thick with the scent of old parchment, beeswax, and the faint, sweet smell of decaying ink. A single candle flickers, its tiny flame casting long, dancing shadows that make the corners of the room seem to shrink and grow with every breath. You are in a scriptorium in late 6th century Francia. Before you, a monk hunches over a desk. This is our storyteller. Perhaps it is Gregory, the Bishop of Tours. He is dipping his quill into a pot of oak gall ink, his brow furrowed in concentration. He is not just recording events, he is shaping them. He is crafting a villain. And on his vellum page, a name takes form, letter by careful letter, Fredegund. Before she was a queen, she was a whisper, a servant in the palace of the Merovingian king, Chilperic I. The Merovingians were the long-haired kings of the Franks, a dynasty that believed their power, their very right to rule, resided in their uncut hair. To shear a Merovingian prince was to strip him of his future, a haircut more devastating than any corporate downsizing. A truly quirky and deeply serious belief that governed the politics of the day. Into this world of sacred hair and brutal, sudden violence steps Fredegund. The chronicles, written by her enemies, paint her as a woman of intoxicating beauty and cunning, who used her charms to first become the king's mistress. The king, Chilperic, was already married to a woman named Odavra. But soon, Odavra was conveniently dispatched to a convent, a popular medieval method for spousal separation, far tidier than arguing over who gets the good tapestries. Fredegund, now the king's favored companion, seemed poised to become queen. But royal politics are never so simple. A better offer came along. Chilperic, for reasons of state and wealth, decided to marry Galswintha, a Visigothic princess from Spain. She was the sister of another queen, the formidable Brunhilde, who was married to Chilperic's own brother, Sigebert. It's all very complicated, a tangled family tree of sibling kings marrying sibling queens. Keep the names Brunhilde and Fredegund in your mind. They are the twin poles of our story, two queens locked in a rivalry that would span decades and drench the kingdom in blood. Galswintha arrived with a grand entourage and an even grander dowry. For a brief moment, it seemed Fredegund was out of the picture. But then one morning, the new queen, Galswintha, was found dead in her bed. Strangled, the rumors said. There was no investigation, no medieval CSI team, dusting for fingerprints on the bedposts. And shortly after a respectable, though brief, period of mourning, King Chilperic married the person who benefited most from Galswintha's sudden demise, Fredegund. From her new position as Queen of Neustria, Fredegund now faced the undying hatred of Brunhilde, who was convinced, as were many others, that Fredegund had either murdered her sister or arranged for it. This is the mainstream, accepted fact of the era. The feud between these two women became the central engine of Frankish politics for nearly 40 years. It was a war fought not with armies on a field, but with whispers, with poison, and with the sharp, silent work of the assassin. And this is where the stories, courtesy of our monk, Gregory of Tours, begin to paint Fredegund not just as a murderer, but as a master of what we might call perverse political theater. He tells us she was a woman who did not merely eliminate her rivals. She did so with a chilling creativity. When she felt her own stepsons were a threat to the future of her own children, they met unfortunate ends. One was stabbed during a tense political meeting. Another, after losing a battle, was found dead in his tent, with a knife in his back that his own messenger claimed the prince had used on himself out of despair. A conclusion that seems convenient. Gregory writes of assassins sent with poisoned daggers, specially designed to be concealed in a hollowed-out box. He tells of two clerics, dispatched with enchanted knives, tasked with murdering Fredegund's great rival, Brunhilde, and her son. The plan was for them to gain the queen's trust by pretending to be refugees, and then strike. It was a failure, of course. A surprising number of Fredegund's alleged plots failed, which suggests that either she wasn't very good at it, or her assassins were in dire need of a better performance review system. One has to wonder if there were exit interviews. The stories grow darker, more personal. They accuse her of rampant infidelity. The most famous tale involves her and a high-ranking court official named Landeric. According to Gregory, King Chilperic returned unexpectedly from a hunt and discovered the two of them together. A classic sitcom premise, but with significantly higher stakes. To prevent the king from acting on his discovery, Fredegund allegedly arranged for her own husband to be assassinated that very evening as he returned to their villa. He was stabbed by an unknown assailant who was never found. And here we find one of those wonderful gray areas where history becomes a matter of perspective. Historians still argue whether Fredegund was truly the architect of her husband's murder. Was it a crime of passion and self-preservation, as her detractors claimed? Or was the king killed by a political enemy, and the story of the affair was a convenient fiction, pinned on the now-widowed queen to discredit her and her young son, the heir to the throne? It's the oldest trick in the political playbook, really. When you can't attack their policies, you attack their character. A tactic as effective in the 6th century as it is today. After Chilperic's death, Fredegund ruled as regent for her infant son, Clother II. She was, by all accounts, a ruthless and effective ruler. She commanded armies, she forged alliances, and she protected her son's inheritance with a ferocity that even her enemies had to acknowledge. She outmaneuvered her rivals time and again, securing her son's kingdom in a world where a child king was usually just a pawn to be quickly swept from the board. But the stories that survived are not of her political skill. They are the stories from the scriptorium, the whispers of a monstrous queen who sent men to kill bishops with poisoned communion bread, who had rivals trampled by horses, who ruled through fear and seduction. The perversion attributed to her is not just sexual, but a perversion of the natural order. A servant who became a queen, a woman who wielded power like a man, a mother who would kill for her child. In the end, after a life of turmoil and bloodshed, Fredegund died peacefully in her bed of old age. A quiet, anticlimactic end for a woman whose life was recorded as anything but. She was buried in the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris, her story left in the hands of the men who despised her. As you imagine that flickering candle in the scriptorium finally being snuffed out, the ink drying on the page, you are left with the ghost of a queen. Was she the monster they claimed? Or was she simply a brilliant, ruthless survivor whose story was written by the losing side? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the shadows cast by that single flame. Let the memory of Fredegund dissolve, like a face reflected in dark water. We leave her to her quiet Parisian tomb, and let our journey drift southward. The centuries peel away, 500 years passing in a single, silent breath. The cold, damp air of Francia thins, warming under a more intense sun. The thick forests give way to high, arid plains, dusty and vast, punctuated by rocky hills crowned with stone fortresses. You are now in the heart of the Iberian Peninsula, at the dawn of the 12th century. A land of frontiers, of holy war and fragile truces, where the cross and the crescent were locked in a slow, centuries-long dance. This is the kingdom of Leon in Castile, and its ruler is not a man, but a woman. Her name is Urraca. Unlike Fredegund, who clawed her way up from the servants' quarters, Urraca was born to the purple. She was the daughter of the great King Alfonso VI, the conqueror of Toledo. She was educated, intelligent, and from her earliest days, she understood that she was not merely a princess, but a prize and a power unto herself. Her first marriage was a predictable political maneuver, a union with a French nobleman, Raymond of Burgundy. It was a perfectly respectable, if uninspired, match that produced a son and heir, another Alfonso. It seemed Urraca's path was set. She would be the dutiful wife, the mother of a king. But fate and her father had other plans. When both her husband Raymond and her father's only male heir died, Urraca was suddenly, shockingly, thrust into the direct line of succession. In 1109, she became the first regnant queen in European history to hold a major throne in her own right. A powerful, widowed queen in her late 20s, ruling one of the most volatile kingdoms in Christendom. Her nobles and her late father had one primary concern. The kingdom needed a king, a warrior to lead the armies of the Reconquista against the formidable Almoravid dynasty to the south. And so a marriage was arranged. A spectacular one. Her intended was the formidable warrior king of neighboring Aragon, Alfonso I, known to history as the Battler. It seemed like a perfect match on paper. The union of Castile, Leon, and Aragon would create a Christian superstate, a bulwark against any foe. It was the medieval equivalent of a corporate merger designed to dominate the market. The only problem was that the two CEOs absolutely despised each other. Their marriage was a catastrophe from the start. Both were proud, stubborn, and accustomed to absolute authority. Alfonso the Battler expected his wife to be a subordinate consort. Urraca, Queen of Castile and Leon by the grace of God, had no intention of being anyone's subordinate. The chronicles of the time, written by monks who were clearly grabbing their popcorn, detail a relationship of almost comical dysfunction. They argued publicly. They separated, reconciled, and separated again. Alfonso once placed his wife under siege in a castle. She, in turn, encouraged her loyal nobles to rebel against him. They needed less a marriage contract and more a binding peace treaty with a UN peacekeeping force. It was in the midst of this royal soap opera that Urraca began to scandalize the courts of Europe. Feeling trapped in a miserable and politically unworkable marriage, she simply ignored it. She sought solace and political alliance elsewhere. She began to take lovers from among her own Castilian nobility, men who would support her claim to rule alone, against her unwanted Aragonese husband. The most significant of these men was Count Pedro González de Lara. He was handsome, powerful, and utterly devoted to his queen. Their relationship was not a secret affair conducted in hushed corridors. It was an open fact of court life. Urraca appeared with him in public, she gave him positions of power, and she bore him 2 children. For the medieval mind, this was a profound shock. It wasn't just the perceived immorality of it. A king having mistresses and illegitimate children was common, almost expected. But a queen's body was a vessel of the state. Her duty was to produce a single, undisputed legitimate heir. By choosing her own partner and having children outside of her politically sanctioned marriage, Urraca was creating a dynastic crisis. Who were these new children? Could the Count of Lara, her lover, make a claim for the throne through them? It threw the entire line of succession into question. This is where Urraca's story becomes so fascinating. She wasn't just flouting convention, she was asserting a radical kind of power. She even adopted the title Totius Hispaniae Imperatrix, Empress of all Spain. It was an audacious claim, a title her father had used, and by adopting it, she was signaling that she was the supreme authority, not her husband, not the nobles, not even the Pope who had sanctioned her disastrous marriage. This is a quirky but profound detail. She was using the language of power to build a reality where her authority was absolute and her personal choices were her own. Her relationship with Lara was a constant source of strife, not just with her husband, but eventually with her own legitimate son, Alfonso Raymondez. Imagine the awkwardness for the young heir, watching his mother openly favor a lover and his half-siblings. It was less a meet your new stepdad moment and more a meet the man who might be trying to usurp your entire future. The young Alfonso eventually led rebellions against his own mother, backed by nobles who were tired of the chaos and the influence of the Lara family. And so, we come to the central question of Urraca's reign. Historians still argue whether Urraca's romantic choices were driven by personal desire or were calculated political moves. Was she a woman led by an unruly heart, seeking comfort and affection in a world that treated her as a political chess piece? Or was she a shrewd political operator, using affairs as a tool to build a loyal faction of Castilian nobles against foreign and domestic threats? Perhaps the Count of Lara was not just a lover, but her most reliable general and political partner. Maybe the answer, unsatisfyingly for some, is that it was both. Maybe she was a queen who decided her political and personal needs could be met by the same man, and she saw no reason why she shouldn't have what any king would take for granted. Her perversion, then, was not one of strange appetites, but the perversion of expectations. She refused to be the meek, childbearing vessel the patriarchal system demanded. The mainstream fact of her reign is that despite the constant warfare, against her husband, against the Moors, and against her own son, she successfully held her kingdom together. She never lost Castile or Leon. She ruled in her own turbulent way for 17 years and passed the throne, intact, to her son. She died not in battle or at an assassin's hand, but from complications of childbirth, her final child with her beloved Count Lara. She was a queen who lived on her own terms, who loved whom she pleased, and who ruled with an iron will. The chroniclers of her time painted her as wanton and reckless, a woman whose passions brought chaos to the realm. But as you drift away from the sun-scorched plains of Spain, you might see it differently. You might see a queen who simply demanded the right to rule her own kingdom and her own heart. A scandalous idea, perhaps, but one that, in the quiet of this room, seems remarkably, refreshingly modern. Let the memory of Urraca's defiance fade into the Spanish dust. Our journey continues, gliding east across the shimmering Mediterranean, the water a deep, impossible blue. 2 more centuries slip by. The air grows warmer still, thick with the scent of citrus groves, salt, and volcanic soil. You find yourself arriving in one of the most glamorous and dangerous courts in all of Europe, the Kingdom of Naples in the mid-14th century. Welcome to the reign of Joanna I. If Fredegonde's court was a place of dark corridors and colder steel, and Urraca's a dusty theater of war, Joanna's is a sun-drenched spectacle of art, culture, and luxury. Her grandfather, Robert the Wise, had turned Naples into a magnet for the greatest minds and talents of the age. The poets Petrarch and Boccaccio walked the halls of her castle, the Castel Nuovo. The artist Giotto painted frescoes on its walls. This was not a grim, barbarian kingdom. It was the height of cosmopolitan sophistication. A place of silk, poetry, and simmering intrigue. Joanna ascended to the throne as a teenager, already married to her cousin, Andrew of Hungary. Like Urraca's, this was a political match, and an even more disastrous one. Andrew was rough, ill-mannered, and openly contemptuous of the refined Neapolitan court. He saw himself as the rightful king and treated Joanna, the regnant queen, as little more than a stepping stone. The Hungarian knights he brought with him were boorish and demanding, ruffling the feathers of the established Neapolitan nobility. The tension in the court was palpable, a string pulled tighter and tighter with each passing day. And then, one night in September 1345, the string snapped. The royal couple was staying at a hunting lodge outside Naples. In the middle of the night, Andrew was lured from his bedchamber by a servant with a message of urgent state business. In the hallway, he was ambushed. A rope was thrown around his neck, and he was strangled, his body then flung from a balcony into the garden below. He was found the next morning, a chilling sight amidst the dew-covered roses. The murder of a royal consort was a scandal of epic proportions that reverberated across Europe, and suspicion immediately fell upon one person, his young wife, Queen Joanna. This is the great, defining mystery of Joanna's life, the mainstream historical event for which she is most remembered. Did she do it? The whispers started almost immediately. Her enemies, particularly Andrew's formidable brother, King Louis I of Hungary, were certain of her guilt. They painted a picture of a licentious, cruel queen who conspired with her lovers to murder her inconvenient husband so she could rule and cavort freely. The case against her was built on rumor and circumstance. It was said she showed little grief. It was noted that her closest companions and alleged lovers, like Bertrand of Artois and the queen's own cousin, Louis of Taranto, were among the key conspirators. It was whispered that the queen had taken a new lover almost immediately. One of the more peculiar tidbits from the subsequent investigations, a truly quirky detail, was the testimony of a lady-in-waiting who claimed that on the night of the murder, the queen was preoccupied with examining a tiny speck of dirt under her fingernail, a detail used by her accusers to portray her as unnaturally cold and detached. A speck of dirt, magnified into proof of a monstrous heart. Joanna, for her part, always maintained her innocence. She was pregnant with Andrew's child at the time, a fact her defenders pointed to as evidence she had no motive. Why murder the father of your heir? She claimed she was asleep, that she was kept in her room by the conspirators, and that she was as much a victim as her husband. But the shadow of his death would follow her for the rest of her life. King Louis of Hungary, thirsting for vengeance, invaded Naples, forcing Joanna to flee to the papal court in Avignon. There, in one of the most remarkable legal proceedings of the Middle Ages, she stood trial for her husband's murder before the Pope himself. Joanna was a famously beautiful and eloquent woman. She defended herself with passion and intelligence, arguing that if she had been involved, it was only through witchcraft, that her will had been magically bent by the conspirators. A clever defense, really. In an age that believed in sorcery, it was a plausible way to admit a kind of involvement without admitting guilt. Perhaps she was a bit like that student who tells the teacher their dog ate their homework, except her excuse involved demonic possession. Ultimately, the Pope, likely for his own political reasons, acquitted her. She returned to Naples, her name cleared in the eyes of the church, but forever stained in the court of public opinion. And this is where the stories of her perversion truly take flight. Now free from the shadow of Andrew, she married her cousin and suspected co-conspirator, Louis of Taranto. When he died, she married again, and again. In total, Joanna had 4 husbands, a number that was highly unusual and considered rather scandalous for a woman of her time. It suggested a certain appetite. Her court was described by her enemies as a place of decadence and moral laxity. Boccaccio, who had once been a great admirer, later turned on her, contributing to the image of a queen ruled by lust. He wrote of her in his work on famous women, depicting her as a modern-day Semiramis or Cleopatra, a beautiful but deadly ruler whose sexual desires were a danger to the state. This is where we must pause and consider the lens of the storyteller. For men, a succession of wives could signal virility and power. For a woman, it was seen as evidence of an uncontrollable, and therefore unnatural nature. And so we must ask, historians still argue whether Joanna's court was a haven of Renaissance enlightenment or a den of debauchery. Was she a patron of the arts, a sophisticated ruler presiding over a brilliant cultural flowering, who was unfairly slandered by misogynistic writers and political enemies? Or was there truth to the rumors? Was her court a place where the lines between political favor and romantic favor blurred, where power was traded in the bedchamber as often as in the council room? The tales of her lovers, of lavish parties that lasted for days, of a queen who seemed to collect husbands the way other royals collected relics, all fed into a narrative of perversion. Her perversion was one of excess. Excessive luxury, excessive husbands, and an excessive, unladylike grip on power. She ruled for decades, navigating treacherous political waters, playing the great powers of Italy and Hungary off one another with considerable skill. She outlived the Black Death, countless invasions, and 3 of her 4 husbands. But the ghost of the first one never left her. In the end, her long and dramatic reign came to a violent close. Her 4th and final husband proved to be a poor choice. A new pope turned against her, and her ambitious cousin, Charles of Durazzo, saw his chance. Supported by the still vengeful Hungarians, he invaded Naples, captured Joanna, and had her imprisoned in a remote castle. There, in a grim echo of her first husband's fate, the 60-year-old queen was smothered to death with pillows. An act of retribution, closing a circle that had begun almost 40 years earlier in a dark garden. As we drift away from the beautiful, treacherous Bay of Naples, we are left with the image of a queen who lived a life of gilded tragedy. A ruler of immense talent and resilience, forever defined by a single, brutal act she may or may not have committed. Her story serves as a potent reminder that in history, especially a woman's history, accusation can be as powerful as fact, and rumor can be a weapon more deadly than any rope or pillow. Leave the warm shores of Naples behind. Let the scent of citrus and sea salt give way to something cooler, damper. The green, rolling hills and misty skies of England in the early 14th century. Our journey is nearing its end, but the tale we find here is perhaps the most famous, the most cinematic of them all. This is the story of a queen who was not just accused of adultery, but who flaunted it, who weaponized it, and who used it to bring down a king. This is the story of Isabella of France, the she-wolf. Isabella's beginning was as auspicious as they come. She was the daughter of the powerful King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair. She was beautiful, intelligent, and raised in the most cultured and politically savvy court in Europe. At around the age of 12, she was sent across the Channel to marry King Edward II of England. It was a classic dynastic alliance, meant to soothe the centuries-old rivalry between England and France. A young French princess to charm an English king and secure peace. What could possibly go wrong? The problem wasn't Isabella. The problem was Edward. Edward II was a king who simply wasn't interested in the traditional duties of kingship or in his beautiful young wife. His attentions and his affections were famously directed elsewhere, specifically towards a series of male favorites. The first and most notorious was Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight whose relationship with the king scandalized the English nobility. Edward showered Gaveston with titles, lands, and jewels, ignoring his queen and his powerful barons. The king and Gaveston were inseparable, and Isabella was left in the cold, a beautiful, politically astute queen reduced to a public humiliation. Imagine her position. A teenager in a foreign land, her husband openly preferring the company of another man, the English nobles sneering at her king's unnatural affections. She performed her duty, producing a male heir, the future Edward III, but her marriage was a loveless sham. After the English barons, fed up with Gaveston's arrogance, captured and executed him, there was a brief hope for reconciliation between the royal couple. It didn't last. Soon, the king found new favorites, a father and son duo named the Dispensers, who were even more grasping and power-hungry than Gaveston had been. They monopolized the king's ear, isolated the queen, and treated the kingdom like their personal treasury. This long period of suffering and humiliation is crucial. It's the origin story of the she-wolf. For years, Isabella endured. She was the wronged wife, a figure of pity. But beneath the surface, a core of iron was forming. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact that set the stage for everything that followed: the ongoing conflict between England and France over the territory of Gascony. In 1325, Isabella saw her chance. She convinced her husband, Edward, and his manipulative favorites, the Dispensers, to let her return to France to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother, now King Charles IV. It was a brilliant move. The Dispensers, eager to get the troublesome queen out of the country, readily agreed. They had no idea they were letting the wolf out of the cage. Once in Paris, Isabella's mission changed. She was no longer negotiating for her husband. She was plotting against him. She refused to return to England as long as the Dispensers held power. And it was here, in the safety of her brother's court, that she found her champion and, by all accounts, her lover. His name was Roger Mortimer. Mortimer was a powerful English baron who had been imprisoned by Edward II in the Tower of London for leading a failed rebellion. He had managed a daring escape, a quirky and almost legendary tidbit of history, by drugging his guards with a drugged pear during a feast and escaping over the walls. It was the only successful escape from the Tower of London in its entire history. He fled to France, a sworn enemy of the king and the dispensers. In Paris, he and the wronged queen found common cause, and soon much more. Their affair was the talk of Europe. It was not a secret. They lived openly as a couple, a queen in exile and her rebel lover. This was her great perversion in the eyes of her contemporaries. Urraca had taken lovers within her own court. Joanna was accused of it in secret. Isabella formed a public, political, and romantic partnership with her husband's enemy, and together, they began to plan an invasion of England. She used her son, the young Prince Edward, as her trump card, arguing she was not rebelling, but rather liberating the kingdom from the evil counsel of the dispensers to protect her son's rightful inheritance. A truly masterful piece of political spin. It's not a coup if you say you're doing it for the children. And so we come to the debate that still surrounds this legendary couple. Historians still argue whether Isabella's relationship with Mortimer was a romance of genuine passion or a cold, calculated alliance of convenience. Was she a woman who, after years of neglect, finally found love and companionship with a fellow outcast? Or were they two ruthless political animals who recognized in each other the ambition and daring needed to achieve their goals? Did she love him, or did she just love what he could do for her? As with Urraca, the truth is likely a messy combination of both. Their shared hatred of Edward and the dispensers was surely a powerful aphrodisiac. In 1326, with a small mercenary army funded by her brother, Isabella and Mortimer landed in England. Their invasion was a stunning success. The English people, weary of Edward's disastrous reign and the greed of the dispensers, flocked to her banner. She was not seen as an adulterous foreign queen, but as a savior. The dispensers were captured and subjected to gruesome executions. King Edward II, abandoned by all, was captured and forced to abdicate his throne in favor of his son. What happened next is shrouded in dark rumor. The deposed king was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. A few months later, it was announced that he had died. The official cause was natural, but no one believed it. The popular story, immortalized by the playwright Christopher Marlowe, is that he was murdered in a particularly horrific manner, a red-hot poker being the instrument of his demise, a gruesome poetic justice for his alleged homosexual relationships. While this specific method is likely a later invention, few historians doubt that he was murdered on the orders of the new regime, led by Mortimer and Isabella. For 3 years, they ruled England as regents for the young Edward III. They were the ultimate power couple, but their ambition became their undoing. Mortimer grew as arrogant and greedy as the dispensers he had replaced. The she-wolf and her lover, once hailed as liberators, were now seen as tyrants. The final act came when the young King Edward III, no longer a child, decided to claim his own power. In a daring nighttime raid, he and a group of loyal knights seized Mortimer in Nottingham Castle, reportedly while he was in bed with Isabella. Mortimer was executed for treason. Isabella, the she-wolf, was finally tamed. She was not killed, however. She was her son's mother, after all. She was placed in a comfortable, but permanent, retirement, living out the rest of her days in lavish confinement. She who had toppled a king was now a prisoner of her own son. As our journey ends here, in the quiet of an English castle, you are left with the most potent image of the perverted queen. Isabella's perversion was one of absolute transgression. She didn't just break her marriage vows. She shattered them and used the shards as a weapon. She took a lover, raised an army, overthrew her husband, and ruled a kingdom. She inverted the fairy tale, transforming from the damsel in distress to the wolf at the door. Her story, like those of Fredegund, Urraca, and Joanna, is a testament to the fact that when history calls a queen perverted, it is often just another word for powerful, defiant, and unwilling to be forgotten. What inbreeding did to Europe's royal daughters. Come, settle in. Let the noise and hurry of your day recede, like a tide pulling away from a quiet shore. We are about to wander through the gilded halls of the past, not to witness battles or revolutions, but to look closely at the silent, painted faces that gaze out from heavy frames. Imagine you are walking through a long, cool gallery. The only sound is the soft echo of your own footsteps on the marble floor. Sunlight, thick with ancient dust, streams through tall windows, illuminating the portraits that line the walls. These are the faces of Europe's royalty, captured in oil and pigment for all time. And as you walk, you begin to notice a pattern, a familiarity. It's in the set of a mouth, the shape of a nose, the gaze of an eye. You're not just looking at individuals, you are looking at a family album, one that spans centuries and crosses entire continents. Our story begins here, with the simple, driving force behind these repeated faces, marriage. For these people, marriage was rarely about love. It was about power. A royal daughter was not a person so much as she was a living treaty, a walking dowry, a vessel for continuing a bloodline. Her hand in marriage could seal an alliance, end a war, or most importantly, merge vast territories under a single family name. And no family played this game better, or with more long-lasting consequences, than the House of Habsburg. Their motto tells you everything you need to know. Bella Geron Alii, tu Felix Austria noob. Let others wage war, you happy Austria marry. For the Habsburgs, the marriage bed was a more effective battlefield than any field of mud and steel. Through a series of shrewd, strategic unions, this single family grew from a modest Swiss countship to ruling a sprawling empire that included Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and vast swathes of the New World. It was an empire on which the sun, famously, never set. A bit of a logistical nightmare for scheduling family dinners, one imagines. To keep this incredible portfolio of properties together, the Habsburgs developed a rather exclusive strategy. They kept it in the family. Why marry your son to a foreign princess from a rival dynasty when you could marry him to his cousin, the daughter of your brother, the King of Spain? That way, her inheritance, her titles, her lands, they all stay within the Habsburg fold. It was the ultimate form of dynastic consolidation, turning their family tree from a branching oak into a tightly woven and eventually tangled wreath. This policy of intermarriage was supercharged by the Protestant Reformation. As much of Northern Europe broke away from the Catholic Church, the dating pool for devoutly Catholic rulers like the Habsburgs shrank dramatically. Suddenly, the only suitable spouses, royals of equal rank and correct faith, were their own relatives. The result was generations of first cousin, uncle-niece, and even double first cousin marriages. And this is where the portraits in our quiet gallery begin to tell a deeper story. As you look at the faces of the Habsburg kings, you see the family's most famous and most unfortunate heirloom begin to emerge. It's known as the Habsburg jaw. This is the mainstream historical fact that became the dynasty's unwanted coat of arms. We're talking about severe mandibular prognathism, a condition where the lower jaw grows so much longer than the upper one that the teeth cannot meet. The chin juts forward, the lower lip is full and hangs open, giving the face a long, melancholic cast. Look there, at the portrait of Emperor Charles V. He stands proud in his armor, but his elongated jaw is unmistakable. It was said to be so pronounced that he couldn't fully close his mouth, making it difficult for him to chew. This led to a lifetime of terrible indigestion. One of the quirkier tidbits of his life is that his doctors, working with the best 14th century medical knowledge, advised him that large quantities of beer would aid his digestion. So, the most powerful man in the world spent much of his life battling chronic stomach pain with a remedy that likely only made it worse. Follow the line down. His son, Philip II of Spain, inherited it. Then his grandson, Philip III. By the time we get to Philip IV of Spain, the feature is so exaggerated in his portraits by the master painter Velázquez that you can almost feel the discomfort. His long, solemn face, dominated by that jaw, gazes out with a kind of weary resignation. This wasn't just an aesthetic quirk, it had real-life consequences. Eating was a challenge, speaking could be slurred, and chronic drooling was a persistent issue that no amount of royal decorum could fully conceal. But how did the Habsburgs themselves see this? Historians still argue whether the dynasty viewed the jaw as a mark of distinction or a tragic flaw. On one hand, it was an undeniable sign of pure Habsburg lineage. If you had the jaw, nobody could question your parentage. It was a physical manifestation of your blood right. In an age obsessed with legitimacy, this may have been seen as a positive. On the other hand, they were not blind. They knew it was unattractive, and they were certainly aware of the health problems that often accompanied it. It's more likely they saw it as the cost of doing business, an unfortunate but necessary price to be paid for maintaining their vast empire. The divine right of kings, it seemed, did not come with the divine right to a properly aligned bite. Now let your eyes drift from the portraits of the powerful kings to the women who stand beside them, or are painted in galleries of their own. The infantas, the archduchesses, the queens. They are often depicted with a demure, closed-mouth expression, the artists perhaps kindly minimizing the family trait. But they were the carriers, the conduits, the very mechanism by which this genetic inheritance was passed from one branch of the family to another. A princess from the Austrian Habsburgs would be sent to marry her cousin, the King of Spain, bringing with her not just a dowry of land and jewels, but a fresh infusion of the very genes that shaped their dynasty's destiny. For a king, the jaw was a matter of state portraiture and personal discomfort. But for a royal daughter, whose value on the marriage market was so intimately tied to her health and her perceived beauty, the stakes were different. She was the living embodiment of a political contract, and the genetic terms of that contract were beginning to show, not just on her face, but deep within her body, in ways far more profound than a protruding chin. And as we continue our walk through this quiet gallery, we will turn our full attention to them, to the silent burden carried by these royal daughters. Your gaze in our quiet gallery softens, shifting from the stern, jaw-forward visages of the kings to the women. Their portraits are often softer, their clothing more elaborate, their expressions more constrained. But if you look closely, the family resemblance is there. It's in the full lower lip, sometimes called the Austrian lip, a more delicate but still distinct version of the Habsburg jaw. It's in the long face, the slightly heavy-lidded eyes. These are the women who were the looms upon which the fabric of the dynasty was woven. Let's stop at one particular painting, perhaps the most famous of them all. It's not a formal portrait, but a scene of palace life, a snapshot of a moment in time. You are looking at Las Meninas by Diego Velázquez. At the very center of this grand, shadowy room stands a small, blonde child, her face pale and serious. This is the Infanta Margaret Teresa of Spain. She is the daughter of King Philip IV, the king with the profoundly elongated jaw, and his queen, Mariana of Austria. Mariana was not only Philip's second wife, she was also his niece. Margaret Teresa, therefore, was the product of an uncle-niece union, a condensation of Habsburg blood. From the moment of her birth, her destiny was sealed. She was betrothed to her other maternal uncle and paternal cousin, Leopold I, the Holy Roman Emperor in Vienna. When she was old enough, she was dutifully sent to the Austrian court to become its empress. Her journey was documented in a series of portraits Velázquez, painted to keep her distant fiancé updated on her appearance as she grew. A sort of 17th century, very high-art version of sending profile pics. In Vienna, her life became a cycle of pregnancy and loss. This is the silent, tragic burden that lay beneath the silks and jewels. Her primary role, her entire purpose, was to produce a healthy male heir to unite the Spanish and Austrian branches of the family even further. She was pregnant almost constantly during her marriage. She gave birth to 4 children, but only one, a daughter, survived to adulthood. The others were either stillborn or died within weeks. After 6 years of marriage and this punishing series of pregnancies, Margaret Teresa's own health gave out. She died at the age of just 21, her body simply exhausted. Her story was not an anomaly, it was the norm. This is the devastating, mainstream fact of their existence. The Habsburg family, particularly the Spanish line, had an infant mortality rate that was staggering even for the time. Roughly half of all Habsburg children born in Spain during this period did not survive to their 10th birthday. A king might complain about his jaw making it hard to eat a steak, but a queen's entire career depended on the success of her womb. And their wombs were failing, not through any fault of their own, but because the very bloodline they were meant to perpetuate was becoming a genetic dead end. The consequences of such intensive inbreeding went beyond the famous jaw. Royal daughters were passing down and suffering from a host of other issues. There were reports of epilepsy, of hydrocephaly, water on the brain, and a general failure to thrive in many of the infants who did not survive. For the women themselves, the physical toll was immense. Childbirth is dangerous even in the best of circumstances. For these women, whose bodies may have been compromised by their own genetic inheritance, and who were subjected to pregnancy after pregnancy, it was a constant dance with death. When things went wrong, as they so often did, science had no answers. And so they turned to superstition. This gives us one of the more poignant and quirky details of their lives. When a royal pregnancy was in trouble or a queen struggled with infertility, it was often blamed on witchcraft or a curse. The prescribed remedies were not medical, but spiritual. A queen might be urged to touch a holy relic, or to wear the blessed girdle of a saint, a strip of cloth believed to have miraculous obstetric properties. Imagine the pressure and the fear. Believing your inability to produce a healthy heir was not a matter of biology, but a sign of divine displeasure or a demonic attack. This leads us to a fascinating question. Historians still argue whether these royal women understood the connection between their family's marital customs and their frequent, tragic losses. Did they look at their own family tree, which more closely resembled a web, and sense that something was amiss? Did a queen like Mariana of Austria, who married her uncle and then watched her daughter Margaret Theresa be sent off to marry her uncle, ever have a moment of doubt? It's unlikely they understood the science of genetics, of course. That was centuries away. But they were intelligent women, and they were witnesses to generation after generation of sickliness and death. It's hard to believe they didn't at least perceive a pattern, a dark shadow that hung over their house. Yet they were powerless to change it. A princess did not choose her husband. To refuse a match would be to commit an act of rebellion against her father, her family, and her entire state. So they endured. They prayed, they wore their holy girdles, and they submitted to their duty. They wrote letters filled with quiet grief over the loss of yet another child. They sat for portraits, their faces placid, betraying none of a mother's private agony. The family portraits from this era begin to look like a tragic spot-the-difference puzzle, where the faces are so similar and the outcomes so grimly predictable. Their bodies became the ledger where the genetic debt of the Habsburg Empire was recorded. Every stillbirth, every sickly infant, every young queen who faded away too soon was another entry, another price paid for all that power, all that land, all that gold flowing in from the New World. As you turn from the sad, lovely face of Margaret Theresa, you are left with the profound silence of her burden. It was a burden of the body, a physical inheritance she could not escape. And it was a burden of the soul, the weight of dynastic expectation placed squarely on her shoulders. Her fate, and the fate of so many royal daughters like her, was to be a beautiful, gilded bridge between two branches of the same family. A bridge that, under the strain of its own construction, was beginning to crumble. We should now gently step away from the grand, yet sorrowful, gallery of the Habsburgs. Their story is the most dramatic, the most studied, but the web of intermarriage was not woven exclusively by them. Let your imagination drift across Europe, to other palaces, other courts, where royal daughters faced their own versions of this genetic destiny. The principles were the same. A small dating pool, the need for religious and political unity, and the belief that blood, above all else, was what made them royal. Let us journey north, to the often damp and chilly palaces of the German states and the far-flung court of Russia. Here, another genetic shadow lurked, one far more famous in the modern era than the Habsburg jaw. We are speaking, of course, of hemophilia. The story begins, as so many do, with a powerful queen. Not a Habsburg this time, but Queen Victoria of Great Britain. In the 19th century, she sat at the center of a vast, global empire, and her 9 children would be married into nearly every royal house in Europe, earning her the nickname, the Grandmother of Europe. But Victoria carried a secret in her genes, a spontaneous mutation on her X chromosome. She was a carrier for hemophilia B, a rare blood-clotting disorder. For Victoria herself, this was of little consequence. Women are typically just carriers of this X-linked condition and do not suffer from the disease itself. But her daughters, the princesses of Great Britain, had a 50-50 chance of inheriting that fateful X chromosome and becoming carriers themselves. And her sons had a 50-50 chance of inheriting the disease outright. Remember, this was long before genetic testing. A princess's status as a carrier was a ticking time bomb, completely unknown until the moment it detonated in the next generation. It's like a royal version of Russian roulette, played out with chromosomes instead of chambers. The mainstream historical fact here is the tragic story of Victoria's descendants. Her daughter, Princess Alice, married into the German nobility, becoming the Grand Duchess of Hesse. Alice was a carrier. She passed the gene to her own daughter, Alex. This same Alex of Hesse would go on to become Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, the last Tsarina of Russia, wife of Nicholas II. And she, in turn, passed the disease to her only son, the little Tsarevich Alexei. Alexei's hemophilia became a state secret and a source of constant terror for his parents. His suffering, and his mother's desperate search for a cure, led her directly into the clutches of the infamous mystic, Grigory Rasputin. It can be argued, and often is, that the genetic legacy of Queen Victoria, passed down through 2 generations of royal daughters, was a significant contributing factor to the instability that led to the Russian Revolution. A microscopic flaw, passed from mother to daughter to grandson, helping to topple a 300-year-old dynasty. Victoria's daughter Beatrice also passed it to the Spanish royal family, bringing untold grief there. The disease of kings was, in reality, a disease passed down by queens and princesses, women who were themselves perfectly healthy. Now let's consider the less dramatic, but equally persistent, issues that cropped up in other families. Inbreeding doesn't always result in a single spectacular flaw like a famous jaw or a fatal bleeding disorder. Sometimes it's a more subtle accumulation of less than ideal traits. In the House of Stuart, which ruled Scotland and later England, there was a noted prevalence of depression and what contemporaries called melancholy. Mary, Queen of Scots, her son James I, and his son Charles I all experienced periods of profound depression. Historians still argue whether this familial melancholy was a genetic predisposition amplified by inbreeding, or simply the understandable result of living incredibly stressful lives. After all, being a monarch in the 16th and 17th centuries was not exactly a low-stress gig. It's a classic nature versus nurture debate, played out with crowns and scepters. But beyond these documented physical and mental health issues, there was another, stranger consequence of this rarefied world: the intersection of genetics and superstition. This is where we find some wonderfully quirky historical tidbits. Consider the case of the hairy girl, Antonetta Gonsalves, from the 16th century. She and several members of her family had hypertrichosis, a condition causing excessive hair growth over their entire bodies. They were not royalty, but they were taken into the court of King Henry II of France and treated as a kind of living curiosity. The family was married off to non-hairy partners, and the court watched, fascinated, to see if the trait would be passed down. It was a bizarre, real-life genetics experiment, centuries before Mendel and his peas. Royal courts were obsessed with lineage and inheritance, and any strange physical trait was seen as a marvel, a portent, or a monster, and often all three at once. For royal daughters, this focus on the body was intense. A princess with a visible physical abnormality, even a minor one, could see her value on the marriage market plummet. This fear sometimes led to strange beliefs. In the court of Savoy, for instance, it was believed that if a pregnant duchess looked upon a hare, her child might be born with a cleft lip or a hare lip. Therefore, great care was taken to keep all rabbits, and even images of rabbits, away from the pregnant royal. It's a comical image now, guards shooing away bunnies from the palace gardens, but it speaks to the deep anxiety surrounding the production of a perfect heir. The health of a royal daughter's body was not her own business. It was an affair of state, subject to the scrutiny and superstition of the entire court. These women were trapped in a paradox. Their blood was their greatest asset, the thing that made them eligible to be queens and empresses. But that same blood, when concentrated and folded back on itself, could become their greatest liability. It could mark their children with visible flaws, curse them with invisible diseases, and fill their lives with the quiet, persistent grief of loss. Whether it was the famous jaw of the Habsburgs or the hidden danger of hemophilia, the story was the same. The daughters of Europe's royal houses were the guardians of the bloodline, and they paid the price for its purity. Let the memory of those other courts fade, and let us return, for a final moment, to our starting point, the Spanish Habsburgs. We draw near the end of our quiet walk, and the end of their story. All the interwoven threads of genetics, power, and faith are about to lead to their inevitable conclusion. The tightly woven wreath of their family tree is about to wither. You stand now before the last portrait in the Spanish line. The face that stares out is one of profound and tragic strangeness. This is Charles II of Spain, the culmination of 2 centuries of determined inbreeding. He was the son of Philip IV, and that same Mariana of Austria we met earlier. Remember, she was his niece. This made Charles the son of an uncle-niece marriage, the grandson of a first-cousin marriage, and the product of so many overlapping lines of descent that his inbreeding coefficient, a measure of genetic similarity, was higher than that of a child produced by a brother-sister union. His parents were, genetically speaking, more closely related than siblings. The result was a catalogue of ailments that made the famous jaw of his ancestors seem like a minor inconvenience. This is the ultimate, sorrowful, mainstream fact of the dynasty's end. Charles II, known as El Hechizado or the Bewitched, was born physically and mentally disabled. He had the Habsburg jaw in its most extreme form, so severe that his 2 rows of teeth could not meet at all. He could barely chew his food, and his tongue was said to be so large that he struggled to speak comprehensibly. He didn't learn to walk until he was nearly 8 years old. He was frail, frequently ill, and suffered from seizures. His entire life was a state of perpetual childhood, and his kingdom suffered for it. Factions at court fought for control over the weak-willed monarch. The once mighty Spanish Empire, which had dominated Europe, began to crumble, paralyzed by the indecision and incompetence at its very center. And once again, the burden fell upon royal women. Charles was married twice, both times to foreign princesses chosen for their political connections, and it was hoped their robust health. His first wife was the vibrant French princess, Marie-Louise of Orleans. She was, by all accounts, charming and kind, but she was horrified by her husband's appearance and limitations. Still, she performed her duty, enduring a decade of marriage in the suffocatingly rigid Spanish court. The pressure on her to produce an heir was immense. Every month that passed without a pregnancy was a national crisis. This is where superstition re-emerged with a vengeance. When Marie-Louise failed to conceive, it was not attributed to the king's obvious physical infirmities. Instead, the court and Charles himself became convinced that they were victims of witchcraft. The king was subjected to elaborate, terrifying exorcisms. Priests chanted over him, brandishing relics and attempting to cast out the demons they believed were making him impotent and cursing his wife's womb. A quirky, if horrifying, tidbit from this time is that one of these exorcisms involved presenting the king with the disinterred corpses of his ancestors, believing the confrontation would shock the demons out of him. Imagine poor Marie-Louise, trapped in this gothic nightmare, her private marital life the subject of public exorcisms and ghoulish rituals. Marie-Louise died young, likely from despair as much as any physical ailment. Charles was then married to a German princess, Maria Anna of Neuburg. The same tragic farce played out again. She too failed to become pregnant, and she too was blamed. The quest for an heir became the singular obsession of the Spanish court, but it was hopeless. Modern analysis of Charles's remains and genetic profile suggests he was almost certainly infertile, suffering from at least 2 distinct genetic disorders on top of everything else. The story of these 2 princesses highlights a final, grim reality for royal daughters. They were not only expected to bear children, but they were held responsible for the outcome, regardless of the husband's condition. The concept of male infertility was not widely understood or accepted. If a royal union was barren, the fault was laid squarely at the feet of the queen. Her body was the field. If it produced no crop, the field must be barren. And so, historians still argue whether the Spanish court truly believed in the witchcraft narrative or if it was a desperate political fiction. Was it a genuine, faith-driven attempt to solve an inexplicable problem? Or was it a cynical cover-up, a way for the ruling factions to distract from the terrifying reality that the king was incapable of producing an heir and the Habsburg line was about to die out completely? The truth, most likely, is that for many the belief was sincere. It was easier to believe in a demonic curse than to accept that God's chosen royal line, the most Catholic kings on earth, had been brought low by its own blood. When Charles II finally died in 1700 childless, he was the last of his line. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive European conflict as other royal houses, particularly the French Bourbons, scrambled to claim the vast Spanish inheritance. The Habsburgs' greatest fear had come to pass. Their strategy of marital purity, designed to consolidate and protect their empire, had ended up destroying its central pillar and handing it over to their greatest rivals. It was the ultimate, ironic checkmate. As the smoke from that final war clears, and you turn to leave our quiet gallery, you are left with a powerful sense of closure. The slow decline we have witnessed, from a slightly too prominent jaw to a kingdom-ending genetic collapse, demonstrates the profound and often tragic role royal daughters played. They were the keepers of the blood, cherished for its purity and yet burdened by its poison. Their bodies were the sites of dynastic ambition, their health a matter of statecraft, their personal tragedies footnotes in the grand history of empire. The portraits on the walls fall silent once more, their painted eyes holding the stories of the quiet, enduring, and often heartbreaking price of being a king's daughter. Why Roman cities were abandoned in the Middle Ages. Settle back, let your shoulders relax, and your breathing slow to a gentle rhythm. We're going for a walk, not through the world, but through the memory of a world of stone and order, of power and water, that is beginning to fade. Imagine you are standing on a paved road. The stones beneath your feet are wide and smooth, worn down by centuries of cart wheels, marching sandals, and the shuffling feet of merchants. This is a Roman city in its prime, perhaps sometime in the 2nd century. The air is filled with a low, constant hum, the sound of life. You hear the murmur of Latin and Greek, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the cries of vendors in the forum. The air smells of baking bread, cheap wine, and the sharp, clean scent of water. Water is everywhere. It spills from the mouths of carved marble lions into public troughs. It cascades down ornate fountains in the private courtyards of the wealthy. And most importantly, you can hear its distant, steady rush. This is the sound of the aqueduct, the city's true lifeblood. Think of the Roman city not as a collection of buildings, but as a complex, living organism. And its circulatory system was this vast, state-sponsored network of channels, tunnels, and bridges that carried fresh water from mountain springs, sometimes dozens of miles away, right into the heart of the urban center. This constant supply of water was the engine of Roman urban life. It's what separated a city from a mere town. It powered the great public baths, the thermae, which were not just places to get clean, but sprawling social clubs, complete with libraries, gymnasiums, and snack bars. It flushed the public latrines and the great sewers, like the Cloaca Maxima in Rome, carrying waste away and making life for hundreds of thousands of people tolerable. Maintaining this system was a monumental undertaking. It required brilliant engineers, armies of laborers, and most importantly, a powerful, stable, and wealthy central government that could fund the repairs. The aqueducts were not a local community project. They were an expression of imperial power. This is the great, mainstream historical fact of Roman urbanism. The cities could not exist in their grand form without the constant support and investment of the state. And this brings us to a wonderfully human and slightly quirky detail. The Romans had a specific official, the curator aquarum, or water commissioner, whose entire job was to manage this system. One of the most famous was a man named Frontinus, who in the late 1st century wrote an entire book, De Aquis Urbis Romi, detailing the water supply of Rome. He complains at length about a problem that anyone who has ever discovered their neighbor borrowing their Wi-Fi can relate to: illegal tapping. Farmers and wealthy citizens would secretly punch holes into the aqueduct channels to divert water to their own fields and villas, reducing the pressure for everyone downstream. Frontinus was, in essence, the world's most powerful and well-documented plumber, forever battling unauthorized connections. Now let the scene before you begin to change. The centuries drift by. It is now the 3rd, then the 4th century. The hum of the empire is faltering. A series of civil wars rocks the state. Emperors rise and fall in rapid succession. Legions are pulled from the frontiers to fight other legions, leaving the borders vulnerable. The economy is in a long, slow-motion collapse. This period, known as the crisis of the 3rd century, was a turning point. The powerful, centralized state, with its vast tax revenues and legions of engineers, is now distracted. It is fighting for its very survival. It has bigger problems than a leaky channel 50 miles outside of Londinium or a silted-up tunnel near Augusta Trevorum. The decline of an aqueduct is not a dramatic explosion. It is a slow, quiet process of neglect. A small crack in a channel, once quickly patched by a state-funded maintenance crew, now seeps water into the ground year after year. A section of tunnel, blocked by a minor landslide, is never cleared. A bridge pier weakened by a flood is never reinforced. It's the governmental equivalent of seeing the check engine light come on and just putting a piece of black tape over it. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the pressure drops. The grand fountain in the Forum, which once shot water 20 feet into the air, now barely gurgles. The highest level baths, the ones on the city's hills, are the first to go dry. They are closed, their great marble halls falling silent. Then, the water stops flowing to the upper floors of the apartment blocks, the insulae. Then the public latrines no longer flush with the same vigor. The smell of the city begins to change. The clean scent of water is replaced by something stagnant, something sour. This is the first step in the city's transformation. It hasn't been sacked. No barbarian army has torn it down. But its heart has weakened. The magic of Roman engineering, which made life for so many so comfortable, is failing. The city is becoming less convenient, less pleasant, less Roman. And here we find a great historical debate. Historians still argue whether the decline of Roman cities was primarily a top-down failure of the state or a bottom-up process of people simply leaving. Did the aqueducts break because the empire was broke, forcing people to leave the now unpleasant cities? Or did people start leaving for the countryside for economic reasons, to be closer to food sources in uncertain times? And the state, with a declining urban tax base, simply could no longer afford to maintain the infrastructure for a shrinking population? The answer is likely a messy combination of both, a slow feedback loop of decay. As the last trickle of water from a once mighty aqueduct soaks into the thirsty ground, the city holds its breath. The stone buildings are all still there. The Forum is still standing. But the invisible systems that made it all work are gone. And the people who remain must now learn to live in a very different kind of city, a city of ghosts and fading grandeur. The silence in our Roman city is growing. The gurgle of the fountains has ceased. The low hum of distant, organized industry has faded. The primary sounds you now hear are the wind whistling through empty colonnades and the anxious murmur of a smaller, more concentrated population. The organism is shrinking. It is drawing in on itself, trying to survive. Imagine you are standing in that same city, but another century has passed. It is now the 5th, perhaps the early 6th century. The Western Roman Empire as a formal political entity has ceased to exist. There is no emperor in Rome, or Ravenna sending legions or tax collectors. Power is now local, fragmented, and violent. Bands of Goths, Vandals, Franks, or local warlords roam the countryside. The great, paved Roman roads, once symbols of imperial connection, are now arteries of invasion, allowing fast-moving groups to strike deep into formerly secure territories. For the people still living in the city, the world has shrunk to the horizon. The primary concern is no longer comfort or convenience, but simple safety. Look around you. The once sprawling suburbs outside the old city walls are deserted. The grand villas with their mosaic floors and private gardens are being dismantled. Their roof tiles are stripped, their timbers repurposed. Nature is already beginning its slow work, with weeds pushing up between the flagstones of empty patios. The people who remain have retreated. They have pulled back into a small, defensible core of the old city. And here you witness one of the most visible and poignant signs of the age, the building of new, cruder walls. This is the mainstream historical fact of this era, the physical contraction of urban spaces. Cities that once sprawled for miles are now reduced to a few fortified acres. And the materials for these new walls are sourced from the city itself. Watch as a crew of men, not trained engineers but frightened citizens, struggle to dismantle a section of the old amphitheater. The massive, perfectly cut stone blocks, once meant for entertainment, are now being levered out and dragged across the city to form a new, desperate line of defense. They pry marble cladding from the facade of the public baths. They topple statues of forgotten emperors, using their divine forms as common rubble. It's the ultimate act of recycling, born of fear. The grandeur of the past is being used as the foundation for a much smaller, meaner future. These new walls are not the elegant, masterfully engineered fortifications of the Roman High Empire. They are thick, ugly, and hastily built. They cut straight through the old city grid, sometimes right across the middle of the forum, or through a row of abandoned shops. They enclose only what can be defended, a key well or cistern, a defensible hill, the largest church. Everything outside this new perimeter is sacrificed. The old Roman city becomes a quarry for its own shrunken heart. Inside these new walls, life is transformed. The wide, open spaces of the classical city are gone. The Forum, the great public square that was once the center of civic and commercial life, is no longer a place for speeches and ceremonies. Its open expanse is now a liability, too hard to defend. Gradually, its stone paving is broken up and covered with earth. People begin to cultivate vegetable patches where senators once debated. They build crude wooden huts and animal pens in the shadow of the great basilica, its marble columns now serving as a convenient wall for a pigsty. It's a bit like seeing a modern-day city council meeting adjourned to make way for a goat pasture. This process gives us a wonderfully quirky archaeological detail. When excavating these late Roman and early medieval towns, archaeologists often find a thick layer of dark, organic soil covering the original Roman paving stones. They call this the dark earth. It's the physical evidence of this transition, the layer of rubbish, animal waste, and garden soil that accumulated as the open, paved spaces of the Roman world were repurposed for subsistence living. It's the compost of a dying civilization. Life has become precarious. The failure of the aqueducts, as we saw, meant the end of sanitation. Without running water to flush the sewers, the city becomes a much filthier and more dangerous place. Disease is rampant. The population, already small, shrinks further. The great stone buildings that remain are too large for the needs of this diminished population. A temple built to hold 1,000 worshippers might now be used by a congregation of 50. An entire wing of the governor's palace is left to crumble, its roof collapsing, letting in the rain and the birds. So the city is not truly abandoned, in the sense of everyone leaving at once. Instead, it is slowly hollowing out. It is a process of retraction and decay. And it raises a key question for those who study this period. Historians still argue whether the primary driver of this urban collapse was violence and insecurity or economic breakdown. Was it the fear of barbarian raids that forced people to huddle behind walls and abandon the grander parts of their cities? Or was it the collapse of the complex Roman economy, the trade networks that brought grain from Africa and pottery from Gaul, that made city life unsustainable, with the violence being a symptom of this collapse, not its cause? Did the raiders cause the poverty, or did the poverty create a power vacuum that invited the raiders? The answer, as is so often the case, is a tangled knot. The two forces fed each other. Without the Roman army to guarantee security, long-distance trade became too risky. Without trade, the specialized craftsmen of the cities, the mosaic artists, the glassblowers, the silversmiths, had no market for their goods. They were forced to abandon their workshops and learn to farm. The city, once a vibrant hub of commerce and culture, was becoming a simple fortress, populated by people whose main goal was to see the sun rise the next day. As you stand in the former forum, now a muddy field of cabbage patches and shivering goats, you see a world that has not only lost its grandeur, but its very organizing principle. The idea of the civitas, the city as a shared public enterprise, is dying. It is being replaced by a much older, more primal instinct, survival. The air in our shrinking city has grown still. The clang of the quarrying operation has faded, the new walls are in place, and a sense of quiet resignation has settled over the muddy lanes that were once proud Roman streets. Within these cramped, fortified spaces, a new order is beginning to assert itself, rising from the ruins of the old. The power vacuum left by the absent emperor is being filled. Imagine you are standing near the center of this medievalized town. The most prominent building is no longer the ruined temple to Jupiter or the crumbling shell of the basilica. It is a church. It might be a new structure, built clumsily but with great effort, or it might be an old public building, consecrated and repurposed for Christian worship. This is where the new power resides. The local bishop is now one of the most important figures in town, perhaps the most important. While the secular infrastructure of the Roman state crumbled, the organizational structure of the Christian church endured. It was a ready-made hierarchy that could step into the void. The bishop became not just a spiritual leader, but a civic administrator, a judge, a protector. He organized the defense of the town, he distributed grain from the church's granaries, he mediated disputes. In a world of chaos, the church offered a semblance of order and, more importantly, hope. This shift is a core, mainstream fact of the transition from the classical to the medieval world. The church became the heir to the Roman city. You can see this process of inheritance written on the very stones around you. Look closely at the walls of the new cathedral. You see a familiar shape, a long, elegant marble column, clearly taken from the porch of a pagan temple, now laid on its side and used as a lintel above the main door. You see inscriptions dedicated to forgotten emperors, now plastered over or used as paving stones. This practice, known as spolia, the reuse of earlier building material or decorative sculpture on new monuments, was rampant. It wasn't just practical recycling, it was a powerful statement. It symbolized the triumph of the new faith over the old, the literal building of the Christian world upon the foundations of the pagan one. Beside the bishop, another figure of authority emerges, the local strongman. He might be a Frankish warrior, a Gothic count, or a local Roman aristocrat who has managed to gather a band of armed retainers. He offers protection for a price. He might set up his headquarters in the remains of the old governor's palace, or build a crude wooden tower on the highest point in town. His relationship with the bishop is often complicated. Sometimes they are allies, sometimes rivals, fighting for control over the town's meager resources. This bishop and baron duo would become the defining power structure of the early medieval town for centuries to come. A bit like a classic buddy cop movie, if the cops were a man of God and a heavily armed warlord arguing over tax revenue. This new world had no place for many of the defining features of a Roman city. The great public baths, for instance, were now completely useless without their aqueducts. Their vast, echoing halls became a source of building materials, their lead pipes dug up and melted down. Sometimes they were used for more unusual purposes. This gives us a fascinating and quirky archaeological insight. In some abandoned Roman baths, archaeologists have found evidence of squatters, mushroom farming in the damp, dark corridors, and even burials. The once great social hubs became quarries, shelters, and impromptu cemeteries. Their purpose was so completely forgotten that within a few generations, local people might tell stories of these vast, ruined halls being the homes of giants or dragons. The amphitheater, the site of gladiatorial games and public spectacles, also lost its function. The games were expensive, and the Christian church frowned upon their bloody nature. So like the baths, they were quarried for stone. But in some places, like the cities of Arles and Nîmes in southern France, something even more remarkable happened. The amphitheater was so large, and its outer walls so strong that the entire town simply moved inside it. They built houses, shops, and even churches within the arena and its tiered seating, turning the entire structure into a self-contained, heavily fortified village. The oval of the arena became the town's main square. This gradual adaptation and repurposing leads us to one of the great questions of the period. Historians still argue whether the end of the Roman city was a catastrophic collapse or a slow, adaptive transformation. The older, more dramatic view sees it as a dark age descending, a complete break with the past where civilization crumbled into ruin. A more modern, nuanced view sees it as a long, complex process of change. The city didn't just die, it evolved. It shrank, it changed its shape and its purpose, adapting to a new economic and political reality. The fall of Rome was less a sudden explosion and more of a long, slow exhale. The people living in these transitional spaces didn't think of themselves as living in the ruins of a greater age. This was simply their reality. They were not consciously abandoning a Roman city. They were just living in their town, using what was available to them. They needed stone, so they took it from the giant, empty building down the street. They needed a defensible home, so they built it within the shell of the old circus. The marble statues of gods and heroes were not sacred objects to be preserved. They were just big, inconveniently shaped rocks, which, once smashed up, made excellent filler for a new wall. As you look at this new landscape, the church rising, the baron's tower looming, the huts clustered within the shell of the old arena, you see a world that is not empty but repurposed. The ghost of the Roman city is still here, but it is wearing new, unfamiliar clothes. Its bones are being used to shape a new body, one that is smaller, more fearful, but also resilient in its own way. The grand, public, centrally managed city is gone, replaced by a patchwork of private, local, and ecclesiastical power. Let the sounds of the repurposed town, the church bells, the lowing of cattle in the forum, begin to fade. Our walk now takes us beyond the new, crude walls, into the vast, silent spaces that were once the bustling heart of the Roman city. Here, in the abandoned districts, a new power is taking over, one that is older and more patient than any empire, church, or warlord. Nature is returning. You are standing in what was once a wealthy residential district. A century or two ago, this street was lined with the elegant townhouses of merchants and administrators. Now the view is very different. The roofs have all collapsed. The intricate mosaic floors, once a sign of prosperity, are covered by a thick blanket of soil and weeds. A young sapling, perhaps an oak or an ash, is growing up through the floor of what was once a dining room. Its roots are slowly, inexorably, breaking apart the carefully laid tesserae. This is the final stage of the city's abandonment, its slow consumption by the natural world. It is not a violent process, but a quiet, relentless one. Wind and rain erode the mortar between the stones. Frost shatters forgotten walls. Ivy, the great enemy of stonework, climbs everything, its tendrils probing every crack and weakness. The Roman world is being slowly digested by the earth. The mainstream historical fact here is that many once great Roman cities did not just shrink. Parts of them vanished entirely from the map for centuries. Places like Caliva Atrebatum in Britain, modern Silchester, were once major regional centers. Today, there is nothing there but rolling fields and farmland, its entire layout visible only from the air as crop marks, the ghosts of streets and buildings etched in the color of the wheat. The city did not evolve. It was completely abandoned and returned to pasture. What must it have felt like to live in the shrunken medieval town and look out at these sprawling, silent ruins just beyond your walls? They were a constant, looming presence. This was not a pristine wilderness. It was a landscape of man-made ghosts. You could walk through entire neighborhoods of empty, crumbling stone houses. You could trace the lines of streets that led nowhere. You might stumble upon a headless statue half buried in the earth, its marble skin cool and smooth beneath a carpet of moss. This uncanny landscape gave rise to a rich folklore. This is one of the most intriguing and quirky aspects of the period. In the absence of historical records, medieval people invented stories to explain the monumental ruins they lived amongst. They were not built by ordinary men, the stories went. They were the work of giants, or were built by the devil in a single night. The crumbling amphitheaters were the palaces of forgotten demon kings. The echoing vaults of the baths were gateways to the underworld. In Britain, the Anglo-Saxons, looking at the sturdy Roman walls and paved roads, composed poems like The Ruin, which elegiac ally describes the work of giants, now shattered by fate. It's a bit like us finding a fully functional iPhone in a field and concluding it must have been dropped by aliens. The technology of the past was so far beyond their own capabilities that it seemed magical, supernatural. These ruins were also seen as dangerous, haunted places, but they were not entirely avoided. They were a source of treasure, both real and imagined. Peasants plowing the fields would sometimes turn up Roman coins, pottery, or jewelry, reinforcing the idea of lost wealth hidden beneath the soil. And of course, the ruins continued to be a convenient quarry. Whenever a new church tower needed to be built or a wall needed strengthening, the first place people went was to the old works to pry loose some of that perfectly cut, high-quality Roman stone. The final fate of these abandoned cities rested on a simple question of geography and economics. Historians still argue about the precise factors that determined whether a Roman city would survive in a diminished form or vanish completely. Why did Londinium survive and become London, while nearby Verulamium became a field? Why did Lutetia grow into Paris, while other Gallic cities disappeared? The answer seems to lie in strategic location. Cities that remained on key trade routes, even diminished ones, or that had a particularly strong bishop or defensible position, tended to cling to life. They had a reason to exist in the new medieval world. Cities whose prosperity depended entirely on the now vanished Roman administrative or military presence had no such purpose. Their reason for being had evaporated, and so eventually did they. As you stand in this field that was once a city, watching the wind ripple through the long grass, you can feel the immense, slow turning of history's wheel. The Roman project of imposing a rational, ordered, urban grid upon the landscape has failed. The wild, untamed nature of Europe, which the Romans had pushed back, is now flowing back in, reclaiming its territory. The abandoned city is not a testament to a sudden, fiery apocalypse. It is a monument to a slow, complex process of system collapse. It began with the failure of invisible networks, the aqueducts, the tax system, the trade routes. This led to a physical retreat, a hollowing out, as people huddled together for safety. New powers rose to fill the void, repurposing the old world for new needs. And finally, where there was no need, there was only silence and the slow, patient work of roots and rain. The ghost of the Roman city would haunt the medieval imagination for 1,000 years, a half-remembered dream of a lost golden age. It was a reminder of a time of giants, a time of order, a time when water flowed magically from the hills and wide, paved roads connected the entire known world. And now, as the sun sets over these quiet, grassy fields, all that is left is the whisper of the wind and the deep, silent memory of stone.